Asserting central dominion immediately, this pawn advance opens diagonals for piece development. Developing a knight towards the center, this move immediately contests white's central pawn and sets up active piece play. Securing the center's dominion, this pawn thrust initiates a strategic battle for central squares and pawn structure. Embracing a hypermodern setup, black immediately prepares to fianchetto the bishop, aiming to control the long diagonals from afar. Developing a knight here prepares to castle and reinforces central pawn ambitions. Challenging the center immediately forces an engagement and opens lines for piece activity. Securing the knight's central presence and preparing to castle kingside establishes a solid foundation for white's development. Developing the bishop to g7 establishes control over the long diagonal, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure. Targeting the b7 pawn immediately applies pressure and discourages black from developing their queenside, creating interesting tactical possibilities. Sacrificing a pawn now invites a temporary positional imbalance to potentially disrupt white's queenside initiative. Reclaiming the pawn immediately liberates the queen and aims to seize central space, but opens lines for black's bishop. Securing the monarch now clears the path for piece development and counters white's central pressure. Asserting central dominion, this pawn thrust challenges black's queenside control and opens diagonal avenues for the bishop. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, it now eyes white's center and prepares to support the central pawn push, potentially creating tactical opportunities or disrupting white's coordination. Solidifying the center's control while preparing to activate the queenside and pressure black's d-pawn seems like a good plan here. Bringing the knight to c6 solidifies the center and prepares for development, aiming to contest white's central pawn push. Opening a diagonal for the queen and disrupting black's coordination, this advance probes for weaknesses in the pawn structure. Sacrificing a bishop for knight opens lines towards your king, a bold positional gamble seeking counterplay. Opening the g-file for potential rook infiltration, this pawn push creates a doubled pawn but frees the f-file for active piece play. Realigning the knight to a more active square aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create potential attacking opportunities. Shifting the queen offers better control over the central files and prepares for potential pawn advances. Asserting central presence, black challenges white's ambitious pawn advances by opening a critical file. Aggressively seeking a kingside initiative, white sacrifices pawn structure for a potentially dangerous attacking avenue, though it opens lines toward his own monarch. A deliberate repositioning aims to bolster the queenside and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Unlocking the kingside potential, this bishop now eyes the queenside weakness. The knight repositioning to b6 offers improved knight outposts and threatens to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside. Opening the d-file aims to centralize the rook and pressure black's queenside structure, anticipating future pawn advances. Challenging white's d-pawn advance, this squares off the queen for potential central influence and preparation for the b-pawn's liberation. Securing the king's safety is paramount. Castling now offers respite from immediate tactical threats. Centering the rook prepares to contest the d-file, potentially creating important counterplay and loosening white's central grip. Securing the open file now allows for potential pressure along the c-file, challenging black's defensive structure. Targeting the queenside, this maneuver prepares for a queenside pawn push, potentially disrupting white's centralized structure. Solidifying the d-file is paramount now, preparing for potential advances or a strategic retreat. Aggressively targeting the white king's flank, this move injects immediate tactical complications and aims to disrupt white's coordination. Striking the queen simplifies matters, opening lines for your rooks and offering a cleaner endgame path. Capturing the knight unifies black's pawns but opens the g-file, potentially weakening the king's shelter. Seizing a vital diagonal, white resolves the pawn structure and opens lines for active piece play. Unlocking the file for attacking operations is the primary objective now, even at the cost of doubled pawns. Sacrificing a pawn opens the d-file for your rook, potentially creating attacking chances against black's vulnerable kingside. Reclaiming the central pawn opens crucial attacking diagonals for your queen and knights. Unlocking the e-file by pushing the pawn forward creates an immediate strategic dilemma for black's queen. Reclaiming the center with the knight offers excellent counterplay. Sacrificing the bishop opens a decisive outpost on c6, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and seize the initiative. The rook's descent forces a material exchange, simplifying the position and opening possibilities on the d-file. This defensive maneuver reclaims the rook, setting the stage for a pawn race on the open files. Asserting control over the open c-file, the rook begins its penetration into enemy territory. Initiating a decisive knight maneuver, aiming to dominate the central squares and restrict black's rooks. Unlocking the c-file is paramount. Now, secure piece harmony for the coming endgame battle. Consolidating control over the open c-file becomes paramount, forcing a reckoning for black's outposts. The knight repositions, eyeing the weak pawns and preparing to contest the open files. Fortifying the central post with the rook prepares a potent clamping maneuver. Solidifying the d-pawn and preparing to challenge the open files with the rooks. Snapping the pawn opens a vital central avenue for your rook. Initiating a counterthrust along the open files, aiming to disrupt white's advanced pawn structure and potentially activate the rook. Targeting the vulnerable rook on b8, this knight maneuver aims to exploit the cramped queenside and potentially create a passed pawn. Reclaiming the initiative by occupying the central open file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Challenging black's passed pawn aims to disrupt their central control. Fulfilling the knight's mission to penetrate the queenside, this redeployment seeks to disrupt white's bishop dominance. This redeployments the monarch to a more secure central position, shielding it from potential pawn breaks and preparing for a more active role in the coming endgame. Initiating a delicate regrouping, the bishop now eyes the queenside majority, aiming to bolster the central pawn structure. Unlocking the rook's activity, this pawn push forces a difficult decision for black's bishop. Rallying your knight to the central battleground, preparing to reclaim lost pawn territory and challenge the bishop's outpost. Seeking to centralize the king, the monarch embarks on a journey toward the action, aiming to bolster the pawn majority. A dynamic sortie, this knight lands on a powerful outpost, immediately disrupting white's central control and forcing a concession. Exposing your king to discovery tactics, by advancing it into a vulnerable central square risks immediate tactical complications. A daring check that forces a trade of knights, potentially opening lines for your rook if white recaptures awkwardly. Repositioning the king to escape the knight's perpetual threat, aiming for a safer square while keeping options open. Snatching a tempo, the knight forces the white king into a tighter spot, aiming to disrupt white's king safety. Pushing the king forward aims to exploit the slight inactivity of black's pieces, but it risks overextending and becoming a target. Reasserting pressure on that backward c-pawn is a smart way to disrupt white's plan and potentially open lines for your rook. Slamming the rook onto the 8th rank locks the black king into a corner, preparing a swift demolition. Simplifying the material, black accepts the exchange, aiming to exploit white's exposed king and open files for their rooks. Opening the c-file creates a decisive structural advantage, as your opponent's king now lacks any safe squares. Capturing the pawn with the knight opens up the king's diagonal, creating an endgame advantage through piece activity. Actively liberating your queen's bishop from its confinement, this pawn push aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side. Unleashing a knight onto the king side suddenly creates new attacking avenues and forces white to react defensively. This pawn push creates vital space on the queen side, potentially threatening to advance further and restrict black's knight. Exploiting the unprotected king, This check forces a king shuffle and opens avenues for your remaining pieces. King ventures out, seeking an active role, but a tactical minefield awaits with the advanced pawn and exposed monarch. The bishop retreats, repositioning to eye the weakened kingside pawn structure and prepare for an assault on the d-pawn. Protecting the h-pawn opens a vital escape route for the king, preventing immediate tactical threats. Unleashing the pinned knight suddenly injects dynamism into the center, seeking activity before the opponent consolidates. Sacrificing the bishop opens critical lines toward black's vulnerable king. Relocating the monarch offers a crucial safe haven as the opponent's pieces are closing in. Forcing the black king out of its protective pawn shield into a compromised position. Unblocking the king after the exchange, allowing it to participate more actively in the impending king hunt. Probing the knight's position, this advance aims to disrupt black's central control and open lines. Hoping to reroute the king to safety, but the passed pawn on a6 is now a serious threat. Consolidating the monarch's position is paramount now, seeking a safe haven away from black's active pieces. 45 g5. Shifting the pawn structure creates a new avenue for the king's escape, potentially disrupting white's coordination and opening defensive lines. Initiating a pawn advance to claim additional space and potentially harass black's vulnerable king. Unleashing the knight offers a dynamic path to disrupting white's pawn chain and asserting central influence. Aggressively pushing the pawn, aiming to dislodge the knight and exploit the open files. The king's safety now becomes paramount, as this check disrupts white's intended pawn push and creates a tactical opportunity. The king bravely steps into the fray, aiming to escort the pawn forward. Snatching the pawn seizes space, but ignores the potential threat to your king's safety on the light squares. Capturing that pawn now opens up the king and strategically rearranges the remaining pieces for the final push. The bishop vacates its post, preparing to seize the open b-file for crucial counterplay. Capturing the pawn secures the queenside advantage and sets up a powerful passed pawn.